I woke up to a light like a coin pressed against my eyelids, a pale, humming disk that did not belong in the sky above the lake. I remember the cold on my face, the smell of wet pine resin, the taste of metal at the back of my tongue like I had swallowed a battery. My name is Alex Carter. I was 34 at the time, and I had been organizing weekend camping trips with my friend Sean for years. We grew up 2 towns over from each other in rural Ohio, and by 2019 we knew every gravel turn of the country roads that lead to the reservoir. I know my gear. I check my Garmin Montana 680 2 times before leaving. I keep a charged satellite messenger, and I never leave without telling at least 3 people where I will be. I was not reckless then, and I am not reckless now. The night Sean vanished began like any other, with a campfire and cheap coffee, but it ended with a hole in the world where my friend used to be. We set up camp at Cedar Hollow, a place I had mapped a dozen times. The ground smelled like damp leaves. The air tasted of lake and smoke. The night sounded like frogs and a distant train whistle. Sean arrived with his usual laugh, a flask, and a battered old sleeping bag that he swore still had the imprint of his father's cigarette lighter. We cooked hot dogs on skewers, the fat sparking and stinging our noses, and we exchanged small talk about work and a woman Sean had started seeing. He had a way of leaning forward when he told a story, elbows on knees, voice low enough that the fire seemed to want to listen. At one point he slapped my knee and said, "Do you ever feel like something is watching from the trees and you are the only one who can see it?" I laughed it off, the sound hollow in the dark. We crawled into our tents around midnight. I remember zipping up the vestibule, hearing Sean's tent flap, and thinking that was the last normal moment of my life. Sometime close to 2 in the morning, I woke with the sensation of pressure on my chest and a ringing in my ears like a distant generator. I could not open my eyes easily. Every blink felt like sand under the lids. Then there was the light, a low, wide disk hovering above the tree line. Not the point of a flashlight, but a flat, field-like glow with edges that seemed to shimmer. The sound was a low electrical thrum and a distant crackle similar to old AM radio picking up interference. I unzipped my tent slowly because the fabric felt unusually heavy, as if it had been dampened by something I could not see. Outside, the ground felt oddly soft under my sneakers, and the air, though cold, had a sweet metallic aftertaste. I called Sean by name twice, my voice small. At first there was silence and the sound of my own blood. Then I heard a rustle away from the fire, and the shout of his name answered not by him, but by a noise like a branch breaking and something moving through wet grass. I unzipped fully and crawled out. The campfire was down to embers that threw off a dry, papery smoke smell. I remember the flashlight beam slicing the black and catching, 50 yards from our camp, a set of footprints that stopped, abruptly, as if their maker had been lifted. I remember the feeling in my stomach turning like a key in a lock. Sean's pack lay where he had left it, straps tangled, a half-full water bottle tipped on its side with a bitter smell of coffee seeping into the soil. On the soggy ground there was a scrap of paper, a torn piece from a grocery receipt, and on it, in my friend's handwriting, the single word, "Look." I knelt and touched the paper. It felt warm, as if it had been recently held. That was the moment I understood this was no ordinary disappearance, and that the explanation was not going to be simple. My first reactions were practical and fast. I shouted his name until my throat burned. I checked around the tree line, sweeping the flashlight across trunks, feeling the bark under my palm that was rough and cold, hearing the pop of late-night insects. I used my Garmin to mark the campsite coordinates and sent a short check-in to my sister Lydia, telling her we were all right, planning to call in the morning. I called Sean on his cell, and it went straight to voicemail, a tinny beep and then nothing. I went to the water and looked for footprints in the mud, and there were none leading toward the boat launch. Instead, the tracks seemed to fade into the air, as if the ground itself had swallowed the final steps.
I found a hair a few feet from the fire on a charred log, a dark strand that was not mine and not like Sean's, finer, with a sheen that caught the light like oil. I put it into my pack in a Ziploc bag and tried to process. Everything felt too loud up close and too distant at the same time, like the world had been turned halfway up and halfway down. The aftermath was immediate chaos. I called 911 at 3:15, and the voice on the line was professional and steady and contained a calm that did not reach my throat. Officer Maria Ramirez arrived 45 minutes later, boots stirring wet leaves, smelling faintly of motor oil and coffee, her flashlight beam sharp and clinical. She spoke to me, and I tried to answer without collapsing into the hot tiredness pooling behind my eyes. There was a deputy
named Mike Klein who took notes, his pen scratching rapidly, and he took my statement in a small notebook with neat block letters. My neighbor Jenna, who had driven down after I texted her, stood nearby holding a thermal blanket, her hands trembling visibly, lips blue from the cold. I explained the footprints and the paper and the hair. The officers took photographs of the campsite, the embers, the footprints that stopped mid-stride, the water bottle. I watched them sprinkle luminol like strange confetti across the mud, though there was no blood to reveal. The texture of the night felt different after police lights arrived, as if a second reality had been layered over the first. People whispered. The air smelled like diesel from flashlights and fear. There was a short scene of questioning around 3:30 in front of my car, where dialogue piled up and words became physical. Officer Ramirez asked calmly where we had set up the tent. I answered. I told Mike about the receipt. Jenna asked if anyone had seen lights before. I said yes, I had. And then there were exchanges that felt like pebbles thrown into a deep well. Officer Ramirez said, "Did you see anyone else?" I said no. She asked, "Did you hear anything else?" I said only that hum. She asked, "How long were you asleep?" I said maybe 30 minutes. She asked, "Did you have any fights with Sean lately?" I said no. She said, "Did Sean seem anxious recently?" I said a little distracted. The deputy asked, "Are you sure this is not a joke?" I said, "I'm not joking." Jenna said, "I texted him at 11 and he replied, okay, then silence, and then..." The deputy said, "We will canvass the area and bring a search team. Bring in the canine unit." The tone shifted as if someone had turned a key again, the practical measures taking over the raw edges of panic. Each exchange left me a step further from certainty. Those direct lines, 8 of them in that brief scene, formed a kind of grid that I could walk back across in my mind when I tried to find where the story had collapsed. I did not sleep that night. I wrapped myself in the thermal blanket Jenna gave me and sat by the dying embers with the Ziploc bag and the receipt. Under the weak hospital lights of the patrol car, I could see the ink of the single word, "look," and the thin hair. I filmed the receipt on my phone and uploaded a shaky clip to a private cloud. I felt both exposed and hollow, a noise in the world. The canine unit scanned the shoreline, and the dogs worked until the sun pivoted to gray, and finally the searchers called off the beasts for safety reasons. The sheriff organized a volunteer line, and people who had nothing to do with our lives suddenly stood in a human chain above the marshes, calling Sean's name into reeds that swallowed sound. I remember the taste of cheap coffee someone passed me, the bitter and burned flavor that made my mouth dry, the metallic aftertaste still there. When morning came, there was no Sean, and the GPS coordinates on my device matched the place where the footprints faded. Over the next 3 days, the search expanded. We had a county sheriff, a pair of state troopers, a volunteer team led by a retired firefighter named Tom Hargrove, and a federal agent from the local Office of Investigations who introduced himself as Agent Coldwell and moved with business-like efficiency. The media showed up with cameras and light stands that hummed like insects. I gave more interviews than I had planned, my voice rough, my sentences beginning and stopping. There were technical details examined closely. The deputy photographed the receipt and sent it to a lab. The hair was placed under a microscope and then delivered to the county lab for analysis, and we were told it was non-human in some of its microstructure, a phrase that felt both impossible and clinical.
The single piece of physical evidence shifted the narrative from lost hiker to something else. Dr. Caldwell called it anomalous and said we would need outside expertise. In those days, my life condensed into a stack of actions that I repeated. Check maps, answer calls, sit through interviews, sleep badly in a borrowed bed, and replay the moment the light hovered. It was around this time that I checked the dashcam footage of a volunteer named Marcus who had been canvassing roads near Cedar Hollow. Marcus uploaded a clip from his Garmin Verb showing a road at 2 a.m. and a pulsing light that lifted from the tree line and streaked horizontally before vanishing. We saw colors that did not match anything we knew, a thin teal shimmer and then a white field, and the audio captured a high-frequency whine. I met Marcus at a diner where the scent of frying grease and coffee hung heavy, and we watched the footage together. The clip was short and looped seamlessly. Marcus said, "I did not notice anything until I pulled it onto my laptop. I squinted at the screen. I said, 'Why did you not stop?' He said, 'I thought it was an aircraft at first,' he added. 'Then it kept getting brighter. I thought I would be mocked if I stopped for nothing.'" Marcus rubbed his temples and pushed a cup away. He told me his dashcam was a Garmin Verb Ultra 30 model set to 120 frames per second and that the GPS track matched the timestamp. He uploaded the raw file to me, and I kept a copy. The footage later became one of many odd data points removed from the tidy categories of the sheriff's report. At this point, I want to ask you something, and I want you to pause. If you
Were in my place, what would you do next? I know the question sounds obvious. I know people will say, call the authorities and wait. I did that. I want to hear what you would have done differently, or perhaps the same. If you have ever witnessed something strange, please write in the comments starting with, "I saw something similar," and then add the year, the state or region, and one specific detail. If you can, include whether you had physical evidence like a photograph or an object. Every single comment matters because the patterns only show up when people begin to compare dates and places and details. Sometimes a name or a model number that seems trivial can be the thread that connects two stories that otherwise sit alone. Your contribution helps create a map of memory, and it helps me and others piece together whether Sean's case is isolated or part of something repeating. I will read every comment and consider follow-ups to those whose accounts align. Now I will go on with what I found when the search widened and how the evidence grew stranger, because the receipt and the hair were only the beginning. About a week after Sean vanished, another family in a neighboring county reported strange lights and interference with their home devices. Their name was the Hartmans, with parents named Lucy and Paul and a teenager named Donnie. I met them at the community center where they had gathered with Pastor Mark and a volunteer named Colonel Lowe who had been involved in search and rescue. Lucy brought with her a baby monitor that she had set up in the hallway months earlier for her nephew. The device was an older model, a VTech VM343, and they had a micro SD card with recordings. When I listened, we heard a high-pitched static, then a pattern of clicks, and then something that sounded almost like voices repeating syllables that did not form words. The recording had a thin reverb, as if the sound came from a small, resonant chamber. Paul said the same nights they also saw a column of shifting light above the cornfield, and Donnie described it as a bubble that rose and pulsed and then vanished as if swallowed. We played the monitor clip for Dr. Caldwell, who said it warranted acoustic analysis. The sound had harmonics that did not match human speech, and yet there was cadence, a rhythm that suggested attempted communication. The progression of evidence brought in specialists. An acoustic engineer from the State University named Dr. Emily Cho described the monitor recording as containing spectral components that were not consistent with local wildlife or standard man-made interference. She compared waveforms and said she could not identify a terrestrial source with confidence. We had the hair examined by a forensic biologist named Professor Nathan Reeves, who found that its medullary structure was atypical and suggested the use of SEM imaging for greater detail. We had the dashcam files sent to a private firm that specializes in image stabilization, and they produced a frame-by-frame breakdown showing anomalous refractive patterns. Each expert raised new questions, and each question came with disclaimers.
The language of professionals is careful, full of maybes and the need for replication. That cautious tone can feel maddening when you are carrying the absence of someone you love. There were 3 moments of tension that stand out in time and memory, each one a narrow corridor where fear, doubt, and decision met. The first happened on the 5th night after Sean vanished, when I returned to the exact spot of the campsite alone, carrying only my phone and that little Ziploc bag. The sky was thick with fog, and the trees smelled of wet earth and moss. I walked into the clearing and felt the air change as I stepped into the center. The hairs on my neck rose, and I felt a pressure building in my sinuses. Then the light came again, a low plane of glow that washed the trunks pale. In that brightness, I heard voices behind me and turned to see shapes moving between trunks, though when I brought my phone light up to them, they vanished like smoke. I remember my heart pounding, the taste of copper in my mouth, and a wave of nausea I could not push back. I had to decide whether to run or to stay and document. I stayed and recorded a 30-second clip, hands shaking. Later, when I watched it, the video showed only trees and the faint echo of a sound that did not match what I had heard in my ears. I left the clearing with the conviction that I had been called there, though by whom I could not say. The second moment of tension occurred 2 months in, when the county released a partial report, and a conspiracy thread online decided my name was worth attention. My phone blew up with messages, strangers calling me a liar, and others telling me to stop looking for answers. At a press conference, I faced a row of microphones, and the sheriff said we have no signs of foul play, and asked for patience. I felt exposed and small. After that, I found an anonymous note slipped under my door back at the small apartment where I had been sleeping, the handwriting a scrawl that read, "Stop digging." That note smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old paper, and left me with the feeling of being watched not from the sky, but from very near. I debated retiring from the search and living a quieter life, but the image of Sean's unfinished story pushed me forward. The third moment came when Professor Reeves called with results from the scanning electron microscope and said, "We cannot classify this sample." The scan revealed cellular structures arranged in a way that matched no known mammalian hair. The word impossible was... I felt the ground tilt, and my options narrowed to 2 ugly poles. Either I accepted that something beyond my category of understanding had occurred, or I surrendered the search to authorities forever. I chose the first, and it isolated me further, but it also opened me to a strange, small community of people who had seen things and were trying to catalog them. Throughout this time, I named people who mattered and who acted in specific ways that shaped what happened next. Sean Rodley was the vanished friend who packed his tent with casual thrift and left a word on a scrap of paper. Maria Ramirez led the initial patrol and photographed the scene. Mike Klein did the field notes and kept pushing for the canine unit. Jenna Wallace drove down in the night and brought the thermal blanket and never left my side for the first 2 days. Tom Hargrove organized volunteers and turned the county fairgrounds into a hub for search equipment and hot soup. Marcus Bell shared dashcam footage that preserved a light that was otherwise spoken about only in half-remembered phrases. Dr. Emily Cho analyzed audio and brought measured skepticism and technical language. Professor Nathan Reeves ran microscopes and made pronouncements that could not be easily dismissed. Each acted within the limits of what they could do, and each added to the web of evidence that refused to knit into a tidy answer. Months passed, and the case shifted shape without closing. At 1 month, I had a stack of files and a support group of locals who met under fluorescent lights at the community center and traded stories like currency. I slept in fits and starts and started keeping a journal in which each entry ended with the question, "What would Sean have done?" At 3 months, we convened an informal review with Dr. Cho and Professor Reeves and a couple of volunteers. They went over waveforms and SEM micrographs and the dashcam stabilization. We compared dates and found that similar lights had been reported up and down the ridgeline over a 3-week period the previous year, all within a 30-mile radius. At 6 months, there was a small memorial by the lake, with stones and a photograph of Sean clipped to a weather-beaten post. We placed that photograph where the embers had been, and I remember the smell of wet paper and the taste of salt as I cried. People came to remember and to hope and to demand answers. The sheriff kept a file open and the federal agent checked in occasionally, their tone professional and cool. Over time, the community reaction broadened. Some believed in rational explanations like light pollution and pranksters. Others joined support groups online and shared stories of missing persons that overlapped with unusual aerial reports. A local journalist named Claire Mendez wrote a piece that asked more questions than it answered and drew attention from a national outlet. A
university student studying atmospheric phenomena named Jonah proposed that certain meteorological conditions can create luminous anomalies. He tested the idea and published findings that explained some sightings but not ours. The unresolved pieces remained the receipt with the single word, the hair that matched no known sample, and the memory of light that came and took a man who had been alive a minute before. I do not offer a theory. I lay out evidence and memory and the honest gap of not knowing. I continue to hold a photograph of Sean in a frame on my kitchen counter. I keep the Ziploc bag with the hair and the receipt in a metal tin under a pile of maps. I speak to Dr. Cho and Professor Reeves from time to time, and we share notes. I read the comments you leave, and I archive them. 1 year later, I drove back to Cedar Hollow with Jenna and Marcus, and we stood for a long time near the shoreline. The water smelled of algae, and the air carried the metallic edge I had first noticed. We did not see the lights that night. We did hear frogs and the low passing of an airplane. We left a small cairn of river stones and a weather-resistant card that said, "Remember Sean." The lack of closure has carved a new rhythm into my life. I find myself checking the sky sometimes without thinking. If you have watched this and felt a prickle at the back of your neck, if you have a small scrap of evidence gathering dust, please tell the story in the comments. Start with, "I saw something similar," then say the year, the state or region, and one concrete detail. If you have files, I will reach out to review them for patterns. In the end, I have learned to live with the question in the middle of the room. 1 month after he disappeared, my world had the sharp edges of acute loss. 3 months later, I was back at work, but more careful with my words and with the people I called friends. 6 months from that night, I stood at the lake and placed my hand on the stone cairn. The photograph of Sean is still on my counter, and sometimes I will open the tin and run my fingers over the hair and the receipt until the ink fades beneath my thumb. I do not know if Sean was taken by something stranger than us, or if he walked into a space where a different logic applies. What I can tell you is this: the physical evidence exists, the experts could not fully classify it, and the memories of witnesses line up in ways that deserve careful attention. If this story moves you, subscribe for updates because I plan to continue documenting every lead and every recording we receive. If you have a tip or a file you think matters, reach out. The night Sean vanished changed the lives of many in small and large ways. Maybe one day we will know. For now, the most honest thing I can say is that I keep looking, and I ask you to look with me. Sometimes the bravest act is not to explain everything, but to keep seeking, even when the world does not hand you answers.